Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today for this panel on clinical trials and autoimmune disease. We'll be discussing the vital importance of clinical trials, how they work, what it's like to participate in one, the barriers to participating and ways to overcome them, and how you can learn more and enroll in trials to gain access to the most cutting edge treatments. My name is Julia Macbeth, and it's my pleasure to be here with you today moderating this panel, as this topic is near and dear to me, having a passion for connecting patients to the right clinical trials for them to accelerate better treatments and hopefully one day a cure for their disease. In my role as Director of Research for the Celiac Disease Foundation, I work with biopharmaceutical companies, clinical research organizations, and study sites to facilitate patient enrollment and retention in clinical trials. I also manage the Foundation's patient registry with over 9,000 participants and the Foundation's clinical trial screening platform with over 17,000 patients to date. Here today to talk with us about this important topic are Dr. Pooja Mehta and Kelly Owens, and we're looking forward to hearing them share their respective expertise, insights, and experiences. Kelly, will you please introduce yourself first?
Hi, everyone. Yes, it's so lovely to be here with all of you today. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's such a delight to join you all. So like many millennials, I'm not necessarily doing what I went to college for. I'm a bioelectronic medicine consultant focused on education and advocacy of the field of bioelectronic medicine, which is a role I came into by a series of serendipitous moments that influenced not only my life, but also the scientific field that ended up changing my life. So in 2002, at the age of 13, I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease and seronegative spondyloarthropathy arthritis, which is known to not only attack joints, muscles, tissue, and ligaments, but also organs, including the heart. And to top it all off, I was also eventually diagnosed with ankylosing spondylitis. And after 15 years of active disease and 22 failed biologics and DMARDs and countless complications ranging from pyoderma gangrenosums to blood clots from immobility and osteoporosis from long-term prednisone dependency and malnutrition and cardiac episodes from inflammation, and every joint in my body, small and large, having inflammation in it. The tide finally turned 5 years ago when I participated in a clinical trial evaluating the use of vagus nerve stimulation. And I'm really excited to talk more about that in a few minutes. And now my job is to try to get that out to more patients. So
great. Thank you so much, Kelly. And Dr. Mehta?
Is that me on my end? A lot of interference. No, I hope it's okay. So thank you so much for the invite. I am so pleased to be here. It's such a pleasure to join you. My name is Pooja. I'm a rheumatology clinician, and I'm currently doing research in post-COVID interstitial lung disease at UCL Respiratory in London. And I'm very passionate about clinical trials. I spent a year in industry designing and leading a clinical trial in rheumatoid arthritis of a new monoclonal antibody that's now in phase 3. And I hope to take you through some of the basics of clinical trials and hope to be able to answer your questions. And I have to say, I am so hugely impressed with this program. I've learned so much already, and I'm looking forward to speaking to you all in the Q&A.
Thank you both. Clinical trials really are the lifeblood of medical innovation. Without them, we wouldn't have the incredible treatments that exist for autoimmune diseases on the market today. And fortunately, we have Dr. Mehta with us here today to share with us about this important topic. Dr. Mehta, would you like to get us started with our first topic?
Perfect. So let me take you through. These are my disclosures. I have received some research funding and I provide some consultancy for pharmaceutical industry. I'm going to talk to you about clinical trials, how we make a medicine and the phases of clinical development that you would have heard of before. So I'll give you a quick overview of things that you probably have heard about and hopefully crystallize some of the details. And then we'll talk about the practical aspects of enrolling in a clinical trial, what's important for you to know, and is this right for you? So who am I? I've kind of alluded to this already. I'm a little bit of a hybrid mismatch, kind of oddball kind of person, because I'm a rheumatology clinician, but I'm doing research in respiratory medicine, and I've had a background in academic hematology. I'm a carer as well. I'm a daughter of a patient. My mum has inflammatory bowel disease, and I've already explained that I designed a clinical trial at GSK as part of an industry-sponsored trial, but currently I'm working at the industry academic interface, so I have no industry connections right now, apart from a bit of advisory roles. I apologize, I've had COVID recently. So I'm finding myself now at the center of quite a lot of different specialties: rheumatology, respiratory, hematology, intensive care, and immunology. And I recently was profiled in the Lancet Rheumatology for this quite unusual, convoluted path that I'm taking, which I do feel a little bit uncomfortable about at times. But I've always had the view that the innovation happens at the edge, and discomfort is important to grow. So although sometimes I'm a bit sort of out of my depth, I think that's really important. So I was very active during COVID and published quite a few papers that have helped give us the medicines that we're using in COVID: dexamethasone, tocilizumab, and baricitinib, or steroids, interleukin-6 blockers, and JAK inhibitors, as you know them. And I work with lots of different physicians to make medicines. So I'm hoping to take you through that. So why do we do clinical trials? Well, we want to answer questions. The questions are medicines safe and effective? We need to test these new drugs. And sometimes we're trying to find new drugs to add to existing treatments or to replace them. Or we may be looking at new ways to give the existing drugs. And we might want to compare a new treatment to old ones to see which ones are better or with fewer side effects. So these tend to be the reasons that we do clinical trials. Now, a lot of you, I'm sure, have seen this before. There are so many iterations of this over Google in terms of a clinical development program. And I quite like this one because it's a funnel. We start off in stage 1, drug discovery, 10,000 compounds, then we get smaller and smaller as we go along. In the preclinical development phase, we then end up with 250 compounds, clinical development, of which I'll show you the phases in the next slide, then regulatory approval, and finally one drug. And to make one drug, it takes 10 to 15 years and $2 to $3 billion, which is incredible, and an incredible amount of work and people, collective intelligence of loads of people, and of course, patients. So let's talk about the phases of clinical trials. So the preclinical phases are in the lab. We have test tubes at the top in this mouse. So we do animal studies, all ethical. They have to be ethically approved in order to be conducted. And then finally, after that preclinical stage, we can move into clinical, which is approval for human work. So there has to be that regulatory process. Phase 1 involves just a few participants. We're in the tens here, and that takes about 1 to 2 years. And the purpose is for safety testing. And we want to see how the body reacts to that drug, and we want to test the dose. Phase 2 is when we have the dose that we think is effective and we know that it's safe in these few patients. We then move to hundreds of patients, taking about 2 to 3 years. And here we're testing effectiveness. So is the drug actually working? And here we then try to understand what the actual effective dose is and the minimally effective dose to minimize the side effects, maximize the benefit. Phase 3 is where we have thousands of patients. That takes 3 to 5 years. And here we see what the generalizability of the drug is. Does it work for the majority of patients rather than just the hundreds that we've tested it in? And we weigh up this sort of benefit risk ratio. And then FDA approval. So in the USA, you have the Food and Drug Administration. You can tell by my accent and my obligatory cup of tea that I'm not from the USA, but the FDA from where you are, and then approval in order to use the medicines. And whilst this is all going on, phase 4 is post-marketing surveillance. Thousands of patients in lots of different clinical trials are followed up to look for any secondary effects of long-term use. And that's when we look at post-marketing surveillance. And this is all to make one drug. So if I move on, the clinical study has a lot of different components. The study protocol is probably the most important in terms of getting everybody on the same page as to why they're doing the study and what they're doing. And that requires ethics approval. So a very strict process to ensure that it's ethically approved. The informed consent and patient information sheet is what you will be given and explained to sign and understand. And then we have study visits where we take measurements for effectiveness, so the safety and the efficacy, and I'll talk about that in a little while. Safety is monitored throughout. There may be a medical monitor or a physician equivalent in each site and a central site. And we analyze the data with an interim kind of cut phase where we usually see at an intervening point rather than leaving it through the entire study duration. Is it working? Is it not? It's a sort of go, no go. Is it worth carrying on? Are there any safety signals? And that's usually blinded to the investigators so that they can then be told, yes, it's okay, go ahead. And then finally, when the study is finished, you then analyze all of the data and report it, including, hopefully, feeding it back to the patients that have participated.
2-minute warning.
Okay, so we assess efficacy with laboratory, so labs, clinical assessments, patient-reported outcomes, which are usually surveys, and regulatory approval. The FDA label is really important. And here we need to see what the indication is of the drug, the mechanisms of action, the dose, the side effects, and the interactions. It's one line in an FDA label can take about 3 years to complete. It's hugely important. And why should you participate? Well, we want to gain access to new treatments. We want to receive medical care for which some people may not be eligible. So they may receive free care in a clinical trial that they may not be eligible for otherwise. You can become part of a new medicine and play an active role in this word that we always use, empowerment. I think it's really nice for people to get involved to help make the medicines that they and other people will ultimately use. And the last thing that I want to say is about diversity, because this is a huge issue. We want to make drugs that work for all patients. And in order to do that, we need to do the right trials, which we've talked about design, but the right trials to make drugs for everyone should include everyone. And here you can see that with ovarian cancer, of course, 100% of people are women because ovarian cancer affects women. But with all of these conditions, asthma, diabetes, and so on, there is a white dominance in all of these trials. And that may be for lots of different reasons, but it's something we need to be aware of and trying to acknowledge and improve. So diversity matters because not everyone is the same, and trials should represent the real world. And what do we mean by diversity? Gosh, there are so many different factors: race, ethnicity, gender, pregnancy, genetics, and you're familiar with all of these. It's important for everyone to be mindful of this. So why? Because different people respond to medicines differently. We have different genetics, physiology, so our size, our shape, comorbidities. If I have diabetes, but Kelly has asthma, are we going to respond to the same drug? What about geography? So I live in London, which is incredibly damp and awful, and Julia lives in California, which is sunny. So does the weather affect, does the temperature affect what we're going to do? And there are so many different factors in terms of how our body responds to the drug and how the drug responds to the body. So I just want to quickly end by talking about how we interpret clinical trials. And I want to leave you with a message that it's so much more than positive or negative clinical trials, because interpretation depends on who we're studying. And this is a really nice acronym, PICO, the population, who we're studying, the intervention, what the drug was, what the dose was it IV, was it oral, was it subcut, what we're comparing it to. So a drug can be very positive compared to placebo, or it can be negative or positive compared to the standard of care. And what are we actually measuring? Have we picked the right endpoint? So it's more than just positive or negative. And my last slide is just to show you what this means. So one of the papers that I published on baricitinib was looking at JAK inhibitors in COVID. And I looked at the PICO with 4 clinical trials. Some were positive, some were negative. And it really is because the PICO is different in every single trial. So it's really important to understand. And I'd just like to thank all of you who are just thinking about participating in clinical trials. And for those of you who have participated, thank you so much. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for that excellent primer, Dr. Mehta. Now that we have a better idea of what's involved in clinical trials, it's important to note that clinical trials would not be possible without the people who are willingly investing their time and energy to participate. And Kelly is with us here today to share her personal experience of what it's like to participate in a trial as a patient. Kelly, I'll hand it off to you now.
Thank you so much. That was really wonderful. Dr. Mehta, thank you so much for going over all of that. So, I had mentioned in the introduction that I had battled Crohn's disease and inflammatory arthritis and a host of other complications for 15 years and had 22 different biologics and DMARDs fail. But that all changed when I participated in Setpoint Medical's clinical trial, which was evaluating the use of vagus nerve stimulation to treat, in this case, Crohn's disease, but they had already done their phase 1 for rheumatoid arthritis as well. And now they're actually in phase 3 for rheumatoid arthritis, which is really exciting. But to me, when I first decided to participate in this trial, what it really came down to was that I needed to make an informed choice. I felt like I really needed to understand the science behind the treatment that I was going to be utilizing. So in this case, vagus nerve stimulation is part of an emerging field called bioelectronic medicine. So, prior to enrolling, I learned as much about bioelectronic medicine as I could. And what I learned was that it's a scientific field that consists of neuroscience, molecular medicine, and bioengineering. And its central idea is that injury and illness can be treated by carefully targeting the nervous system using devices. And rather than suppressing a patient's immune system with biologics and DMARDs, instead by modulating the brain's inflammatory signals traveling through the nervous system to the spleen and other organs, bioelectronic medicine allows the body to achieve homeostasis when inflammation goes into overdrive. So this really, enabled me to understand what I was getting into when I signed up for this trial, and also, sitting down with the surgeon and being able to discuss the fact that I was getting an implant, which was very different to treat a disease rather than what we're typically used to with infusions and, or oral pills and that kind of thing. But it was also really important for me to be able to understand what that implant was going to be doing and what the mechanism was and how it would work. And so, I immersed myself in that literature and found that, when the vagus nerve is electrically stimulated, it sends an electrical signal down to the spleen, and there, through a series of different chemical reactions, releases acetylcholine and then neuroepinephrine, and all of that interacts with the T cells in the spleen, and basically at the end point tells the macrophages, hey, you're making too much inflammation and we don't need that much, and and just turns it off. So all of this really helped me understand what I was getting into, and empowered me to make that choice to participate. So on June 22nd of 2017, a small electrode was implanted in my neck, wrapped around my vagus nerve. And 2 weeks later, on July 6th, my vagus nerve stimulator was turned on. And within days, my pain decreased significantly. And within weeks, my joint swelling pretty much disappeared. And 2 months later, I was in clinical remission for the first time since my diagnosis, nearly 16 years prior. And, Mark Twain wrote that life would be infinitely happier if we could be born at the age of 80 and gradually approach 18. And that really wonderfully sums up what my experience has been like with treating Crohn's disease and arthritis using vagus nerve stimulation. And I call it the Benjamin Button effect. And it's been more than 5 years now, and I continue to be in remission. And I'm living proof of how important it is to participate in clinical trials for novel research, because not only did it change my life, but it's incredible to be at the beginning of watching how it's going to transform this entire field of autoimmune diseases. So it's a really fascinating time. So thank you so much for having me.
Thanks so much, Kelly, for sharing your story. So now we'll move on to some general discussion and questions. I'll pose a topic and our panelists will weigh in on their perspectives. We are a little short on time. We've got about 12 minutes left, so we're just going to get right to it. The first one is, how do we become aware of clinical trial opportunities? Kelly, would you like to go first?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. So when I was looking for a vagus nerve stimulation trial, I went to clinicaltrials.gov, and there's a search box in there that you can put in either the therapeutic that you're looking for. So you could type in vagus nerve stimulation, or if you're just looking, what are the overall trials going on for Crohn's or rheumatoid arthritis, or so forth, you can put that in as well. And then it'll give you a whole list of different trials that are happening for whatever it is that you put in. And then when you click on that, it's a very official looking website. It's not exactly like super easy on the eyes. But when you click on each trial link, you go over, you get to see the structure of the trial and all of that stuff. And I think the most important in the work I do now, the most important section that gets overlooked is the contact information that's in that particular page, so that you could get in touch with whether it's the clinical trial coordinator or the principal investigator. But that's often scrolled past because there is so much information and it's very dense. So very important to see that.
Thanks so much. Pooja, do you have anything to add for how people can find clinical trials opportunities?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad Kelly did say that the clinicaltrials.gov website is clunky, because I feel the same, but it is very useful. Your physician really should be abreast of the clinical trials of your disease area. So I think asking your clinician whether they know of any clinical trials that are active in recruitment near you would be a great port of call. And also, if they don't bring it up, then bring it up yourself. Say, I'm very happy to be involved in clinical trials. If there's anything going, please let me know. You can also look up the websites of charities that patient information groups may also cover as well, in terms of the Crohn's Association in the UK versus arthritis in the UK, and you have the equivalent in the US. They should also be able to help. But I hope that your physician would be research active and be able to point you in that right direction.
Yes, definitely. Thank you both for these great ideas. So now that we know how to find trials, let's discuss some of the barriers to participating in clinical trials and how to overcome them. Since it's common for people to feel uncertain about participating in research, especially if they've never participated in a trial before. So what are some of the common reasons that may be holding people back from participating in a trial, and what can we share to help address these concerns? Kelly, do you want to go first?
Yeah, for sure. So I think that there's a whole host of things that could be really complicated, whether in holding a patient back from participating or not really understanding what's going on once you get involved. So, on the one hand, depending on where the clinical trial is, there could be a barrier in terms of what from a socioeconomic standpoint. If the trial is happening in New York or wherever, and you're living in, Montana, then, there's going to be those travel costs. But what is also important is to still reach out and see if that particular sponsor is reimbursing for, travel, or is, giving any monetary, or covering any monetary expenses and things like that. So, so I would say, just because something isn't necessarily happening in your hometown doesn't mean that you shouldn't reach out anyway. And I think that some of the other barriers include, there's just, speaking of how clunky the clinical trials website is, some of the language just in general that we use in healthcare is kind of clunky too. So, knowing what informed consent is, and being able to really take your time, understanding what the trial coordinator is going over, because that's telling you, basically what your life is going to be like throughout the trial, and what risks may arise, and all of that kind of thing. And so it's important to understand that. And, another thing, like, it's important to understand if something says placebo control, that can be kind of scary to patients, because they're like, well, I don't want to be the placebo. And understandably not, no one wants to be no one wants to be in that position. But a lot of times there's a crossover. So, like with SetPoint's current phase 3 trial for RA, there's a 3-month placebo, where at the beginning you don't know if you're having active stimulation or if you're placebo, but then after 3 months, then everybody's crossed over into the active group. So it's important to not shy away just based on that kind of thing. So, but yeah, there's so many. Your clinical trial coordinator can really answer a ton of questions, and it's important to pick their brain.
Thank you, Kelly. Pooja, what about you? Do you have anything to add for what we can do? What are some of these barriers? What can we do to help burst some, these misconceptions, help them understand?
Yeah, I mean, Kelly's made some great points. And just to echo those, I think they're so important. The patient information sheet can sometimes be impenetrable. To be given a book that you then have to read when you're not feeling well is not great. So I think for me, one of the big things that I encounter in terms of a barrier to recruiting patients into clinical trials is trust. Not because I'm not trustworthy, but because I think there is a tendency to feel, gosh, this is a new drug. It hasn't been tested on many people. Is it safe? What's going to happen to me? And often people say, am I going to be treated like a guinea pig? I don't want to be experimented on. And I think trust is really important to know that we've talked about the phases of clinical trials. They have gone through, that drug has gone through a lot of steps and hurdles and been verified and really scrutinized in terms of safety to get to the point where we can offer it to patients in clinical trials. And I hope that when your physician, research nurse, coordinator explains that to you, that you understand that it has been scrutinized. We would only be offering it to you if we thought it was safe. So I think that's an important thing. I also think that there are barriers in terms of, and we touched upon diversity a little bit, but that certain populations are underrepresented in clinical trials disproportionately to the diseases that we affect. Lupus is a very good example. Far worse prognosis in Black women, yet they're underrepresented in clinical trials. And here again, it's a big trust issue, but also it could be communication. There's cultural reasons, and we need to really think about those issues to reach all of the people that the disease affects. I think the other thing I just want to quickly bring in is that there is a fear sometimes that your normal clinical care may be affected. And actually that's not the case at all. And usually patients say that they are even more looked after, if you like, when they're in a clinical trial because they have more study visits and things that they normally wouldn't have. That can be a barrier as well, because normally if you're seen every 3 months and then it becomes every 2 weeks or every month or so on, then that time commitment with your work, with your family, attending hospital is an issue. And then the last thing is knowing that you can withdraw from the clinical trial at any point. You are not handcuffed and committed, you're not wedded to that trial until the end, and nothing will happen. Your doctor will still look after you as they normally should. No one's going to make you feel guilt. You shouldn't feel guilty yourself, and that's okay. So if you change your mind, you can withdraw at any point and nothing will happen and no one will think badly of you.
Yes, that's absolutely so vital to understand. And I know I hear that all the time in working with people trying to recruit for these trials. And I think even just the logistics of the time and financial constraints that people are concerned. And I think this can lead to underrepresentation of certain populations when they aren't able to take a day off of work, for their job. But do understand that there are a lot of these clinical trials do compensate you for your time and reimburse you for your travel. So you can look for the right opportunities that will make that trade-off worth it for you. And sometimes they can also even give you a note or something to give to work to help, for them to understand, why it's important for you to take this day off of work and to participate. So I think that, that can help people get to that point where they can see a little bit better. But also there's been a shift in focus where more and more sponsors for trials are starting to realize that this barrier is important. And so they are trying to help reduce the burden by doing things like home health nurses so that you can do remote visits for clinical trials. There are all sorts of different options. And even if you do have to go to a trial site, they might have options, on the weekend, on your days off. So there are different things. I think it's very easy to think, oh, I don't have the time to participate, or, how am I going to cover childcare? But there are options for financial compensation, and different types of trials will have more or less of, different types of schedules that can help you participate. Is there anything else you guys want to add? I know we've got about 1 or 2 minutes left.
Yeah, I think that pretty much, I think that covers it all really well. I think, Dr. Mehta, you said something really interesting earlier. We said, innovation really happens at the end of our comfort zone, and that how important it is to step out of that and see what's out there, and kind of, sometimes we get into a track where even if we're uncomfortable, it's we're using something that we know and that is kind of the standard of, what we know is the standard of care. But if it's not working for you, it's okay to allow yourself to step out of the comfort zone. And as long as you have that informed consent, and, you can make an informed choice and understand the fields that you're stepping into and the therapeutic you're stepping into. So, so I loved that. I love that note. It's, big things happen when people are willing to step out of that comfort zone and try.
And I think sometimes people just think someone else will participate, but it's really so important if you're able to, especially if you're an underrepresented group, please show up, please participate in these trials. It is so vital. And it looks like that is about our time. This has been a really great discussion. And just in closing, again, I want to thank sincere thanks to everybody for joining us here today, and to Pooja and Kelly for their participation in this important educational event. Thank you, everyone.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been so lovely meeting you.